Welcome, everyone. This is the third session of our mini-conference. And we will hear from Matt Switzer. Matt is a doctoral student in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And he is looking at one of the things that came up. In fact, it was the only issue upon which Francis and Paul agreed, if you might remember. Oh, here's Francis. When they disagreed on many, many things, but I'm talking about you, Francis. But when Francis and Paul both agreed but religion and science have got to work together. They can't be separate. They have to at least be in touch. Oh, there's Paul. So that's the two that. So Matt is going to be exploring some ideas, but also I want you to know that he teaches in a middle school called the Odyssey Middle School, an expeditionary school. So when we are reflecting on how we have to get these ideas to the young people, well, here he is. This is our portal. So please welcome Matt Switzer.
Thank you very much, and Terry and Robert and Ben, and everybody here for the opportunity to talk to you. I have the great misfortune of speaking after Brian, but I'm going to try to make it good anyway. I'm going to try to make the case that Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's alternative theory of evolution, his what he calls the theory of creative union, is both empirical, pragmatic, reconciling his scientific views with this innate urge to seek divinity in and through matter so as to disclose the hidden constitution of increasingly complex beings, and so for this reason might be relevant to the field of AI. The way my presentation is going to go, I'm going to point to a couple of cosmological tendencies that have come out recently, which I think help to decipher Teilhard's vision. I'm going to take a shot at conveying his vision in 5 points that I've sort of found. And finally, I'm going to hopefully place artificial intelligence within the wider cosmological and evolutionary context, so that by aligning this project to those cosmological tendencies, AI might be able to be put in service of a deeper human and perhaps even cosmological objective. So in order to do this, I think it's important to understand the role of God or Christ or the divine in his vision of evolution. As I've come to understand it, as I sort of read more and more about Teilhard, it seems more like he kind of took the same approach as Lemaitre did with Hubble's discovery of the red-shifting galaxies, namely coming to the conclusion that if these galaxies are all rushing away from us, then if we go back in time further and further, there must have been a point where they were all in the same place, the so-called primeval atom. And so in the same way, Teilhard, rather than starting at the beginning of the cosmos and moving forward, seems to start with his own very intense psychic experience as a Jesuit priest with regards to the love for God and Christ, and traces this phenomenon back into the past, finding its planetary and cosmological predecessors in a spiritual and material energy, and that energy which unites them both, the alpha and the omega, as he calls it. And so while I understand that there may be some baggage that comes when we talk about Christ and God and the divine, especially in a modern context, I'm going to invite you all to sort of pick an image or a word that works for you. Teilhard called it the cosmic Christ. You might call it the cosmic logic or cosmic or cosmogenetic principle. But it's evolving in both its psychic and material dimensions as they complexify, deepening the capacity for consciousness and moving into the future. Personally, I'm going to be using cosmotheanthropic principle, but really I'm just going to be switching between all of those probably. So That may or may not help. So to begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about Eric Chaison's idea of free energy rate density, namely the tendency of cosmological structures over time towards increasing complexity. It's basically to say that energy flows through particular bodies over time, whereby the material components are arranged in new complex structures out of which new properties emerge. So you can see a little graph of how this free energy rate density is increasing with each new, more complex structure. So this is the basic framework of the big history movement, thresholds of increasing complexity, so that from the Big Bang, gravity draws together galaxies and stars that fuse together new elements which accrete into planetary bodies, and on at least one planet, life emerges, harnesses the power of the sun, evolves to capitalize on collective intelligence, domesticates animals and plants to erect civilizations that incorporate fossil fuels, and will kill off just about everything on the planet now. This image, you can see a number of increases going on: population, CO2 concentrations, species extinction, motor vehicles, etc. And one more image, the Great Acceleration. But in a way, this is completely normal. A complex adaptive dynamic system cannot sustain itself without maintaining its energy flow, so that without this maintained energy flow, it necessarily collapses. A star can only live for so long before it collapses. Without sunlight, plants die. Without food, animals starve. Without natural resources, civilizations collapse. Businesses fail. And of course, in a closed universe where matter and energy is neither created nor destroyed, the energy flows must inevitably cease, meaning that any and all complex structures will also necessarily collapse at some point. Happy story, I know. One more picture. This was, I believe this was from the Limits of Growth study, sort of their prediction in 1970, where it sort of actually went, and then kind of what we have to look forward to if trends continue. So the second cosmological principle I'd like to share, which might really be deepening of the first one, is Adrian Bejan's constructal law, namely the idea that where energy flows, that energy tends to flow through a mass over time as efficiently and as equitably as possible, which then takes the form of fractal branching patterns that remain self-similar across scale. This is why blood vessels, brain cells, leaves, forests, rivers, lightning, all the way up to cosmological structures all seem to conform to this particular pattern. And it seems that this tendency is also how the internet is arranged. It's the internet on the right, as well as civilization. So according to Bejan's framework, even language is a flow system for information, so that the evolution of written languages, beginning with pictographs, ultimately become more efficient, evolving, for instance, in the Egyptian case, into hieroglyphics, the hieratic script, demotic forms, and into the Coptic script. Basically, the flow of information becoming more and more efficient, developing the language to conform to the need of this most efficient branching flow of information, taking less time and energy to convey a message. It seems, however, that there, at least to me, that there is an important difference between, say, the veins of a leaf and the way a civilization is arranged, namely that while the energy flows through a tree to ensure each constituent part is nourished equitably with energy flows, this is not the case with a stratified society where resources are concentrated in certain elite classes. And in fact, this inequity of energy flow is considered one of the primary catalysts of civilization collapse, along with environmental degradation. So this was a handy model, which modeled the collapse of civilizations. And they found that essentially two major causes for civilization collapse. One was the overexploitation of nature, the other was inequity. for the reason that upper classes consume more resources while lower classes just try to make a living, so that the economic paradigm is insulating everybody from seeing the increasing likelihood of collapse they are cumulatively working towards. And the field of green criminology seems to also give the similar insight, namely that climate change, social conflict create resource scarcities that exacerbate criminogenic mechanisms to cause individual, state, corporate crimes, which feed back to cause more of the same. So that's essentially what I've considered to be the state of our crisis today in so many words. So here's a question then. How to convey this information to others that the civilization you are living in is unsustainable, the activities and social arrangements everyone participates in are leading to collapse, and perhaps most importantly, there's a better way to self-organize that would eliminate energy deprivation, inefficiencies, and the suffering that accompanies it. And perhaps most importantly, how to do so in a violent society where individuals are crucified for their opposing political positions. And one thing I should add, if we go back to Eric Chason's free energy rate density, he actually lists indigenous groups, and I think specifically Australian Aboriginal groups, as the most complex example of this free energy rate density, namely that they yield the highest free energy rate density with regards to this power mass law, so that energy is not wasted, material complexity is not superfluous, likely because small-scale human communities lack storage, so that energy is not hoarded, but can be distributed equitably. And mechanisms protecting against power imbalances can be enforced with greater efficacy. So other big historians disagree with this point, presumably because they like rocket ships and other gizmos. And yet, this complexity can't be sustained because the energy flows cannot be sustained of a modern civilization, whereas they can be at a tribal level. So there you go. Back to the question, though, how to convey this information that civilization is screwed, on the verge of collapse, but through a kind of cosmological principle or biomimicry approach, an imperial hierarchical logic that has severed itself from what Timothy Morton might term the symbiotic real, can be overturned and redeemed to find salvation. Let me see where we are. So I'd like to suggest that the axial age was, in fact, in the first place to this degree, an attempt to create an alternative symbol system that really addressed this imperative, producing, as Robert Bella suggests, a theoretical turn still grounded in core mythological, ritual, and mimetic cognitive processes, whereby a utopian critique of the social arrangement was popularized, grounded in universal ethics, egalitarianism, justice-mindedness, and a relocation of legitimacy from the dominant political and religious social structures to the individual practitioner and the spiritual communities who cultivate very specific practices. And perhaps over the course of centuries, this idea, this information is able to be synthesized in a particular symbol where this cosmological principle is incarnated in the person or symbol of Jesus. That is, we can look at Jesus Christ not as a person then, but as a symbol, a death rebirth symbol, to overturn one logic by another, more attuned to what seems to be a more eternal or divine cosmological principle. Either way, the symbolism seems to get the job done, communicate the possibility for an alternative society attuned to this symbiotic real. Chad Myers, in an article in the Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature, writes that Christianity might be seen as a more primitivist approach to this social critique, presumably to induce the greater degree of social complexity in the same way Chason sees Aboriginal culture as a more complex form than perhaps a multicultural civilization. So here you see various themes that are present in the New Testament, but also in the wider Bible as well. Perhaps invoking the immediate return subsistence living of the so-called original affluent culture, society. One particular quote that I think sort of makes this case: "Consider the ravens, they neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Oh, of how much more value you are than birds." So a little anthropocentric there, but certainly the idea of maybe a more equitably distributed energy flow. So I haven't really said too much about Teilhard quite yet, so here's where I do that. My suggestion is that just as the symbolism surrounding Jesus the Christ becomes transformative in that it realigns the human community with the cosmological principles that ground it, Teilhard's interpretation of the cosmic Christ in light of his desire to merge spirituality and science through evolution offers a way to revitalize the Christian symbolism, as well as our own understanding of how cosmological reality enters into our lives in both a material and psychic dimension, and then also the relevance that holds for cybernetic and artificial intelligence studies. And really, I think this is the reason why Kathleen Dignan states that possibly within the next generation, Teilhard is likely to be recognized as one of the four most important thinkers in the Christian tradition, along with St. Paul, St. Augustine, and St. Aquinas, which are some pretty big figures. Okay, so the following are 5 principles that I've come to know in my short time with Teilhard. Namely, in the first place, Teilhard speaks to the psychic dimension of energy and its ability to influence natural and cultural adaptation. He suggests that while we know what he terms spiritual energy quite intimately, this is a real problem for science, and so he suggests that all energy is psychic, but with a material component, which in the evolutive structure of a convergent cosmos means that the energy not only links all matter together, but draws it towards centration and complexity. So for Teilhard, then, love becomes the primal and universal psychic energy. Quote from him. This then leads him to the law of a complexity consciousness, that with increased psychic energy, more complexity means more consciousness and increased awareness. And so the development of consciousness becomes the essential phenomenon of nature, with evolution as this rise of complexity consciousness. So for this reason, Teilhard's great work then, thank you, is, let me see here. His great work seems to be to help other people see this reality and enable this new perception so that others can then understand this intrapsychic and external energy, the within and without of evolution, and then take an active role in the evolutionary dynamics that are becoming conscious of itself evolving. So to catalyze this mode of cosmic reflection is to enable the material and spiritual circuitry themselves to break in to conscious insight and becoming then sensible to the wider structure of reality in which the experience of divinity resides. So just some quotes from Teilhard. He calls the human being the psychic current of the universe, which through its activation of its forces of unification then drive evolution and increased consciousness. Another quote, like a subtle and essential energy, it transmits the pulsations of God's will. God is at work within life. I can feel God, touch God, live him in the deep biological current that runs through my soul and carries it with it. So this current that runs through his soul advances in a very specific direction, so that if the human person is to come up to the fullness of his potential, he must become conscious of his infinite capacity for carrying himself still further, that self-conscious evolution. So then this in turn suggests the increased awareness and flowering of spiritual energy as it enters every new emergent form. this tendency for union and synthesis, which Teilhard calls love, the psychic energy that drives evolution of complex consciousness, then suggests that evolution is the alpha and omega's creative activity in time, and yet it's unfinished, and that's our role is to enter that energy current and merge ourselves with that wider principle. So his work traces the energy from the cosmogenesis of pre-life, leading to the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, to the biogenesis of life, or biosphere, to the anthropo and noogenesis, where human thought emerges as cosmic evolution becomes harmonized in his language. And yet, even within this noosphere, the tendency for union creates the opportunity for even higher centration, for a deeper synthesis. And so in this regard, Christ, or the Logos, or this cosmotheanthropic principle, emerges through each of these different spheres, so that the primal and universal psychic energy breaks into all of these different spheres through this process of Christogenesis, leading to this Christosphere. Here it's called the pneumatosphere. Breaking into new complex forms of consciousness with love in its harmonized form. And to sort of sum this up, Teilhard, sort of a few days before he passes away, writes that cosmogenesis equals Christogenesis, where the attraction or synthesis melts each of these spheres into one another through a common convergence in that cosmological principle. So I won't go too much into this, but essentially, if evolution is the unfolding of creativity, this flourishing energy is manifest in our activity, and so human effort becomes divinizable to those ends, where we each have a sort of Christic potential to enter into that divine energy. Or put it another way, we come to Jesus through the world, whose intensity increases and in intensity and influence as spirit is awakened. Thank you. I'm almost done. And move on to the next one here. Teilhard's point is quite simple, that to become whole persons, one needs to become universalized in a sense, operationalizing this new mode of complex consciousness where primal psychic energy or love is able to merge these to this matter and spirit, which then annihilates the ego, in his words, and moving us towards a Christic ego that can be codified, codifying these loving practices in social life. In that regard, the cosmos is undergoing a process of amorization, where a new layer of love grounds the emergence of a new mode of consciousness in any activity, totalizing these psychological resources of the world at a given moment. So I do feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over here, but it is essentially to suggest that Teilhard's contribution is that seeing cosmic evolution, having planetized and harmonized, and the Christosphere emerges as a, quote, advanced phylum in cosmic evolution. And this is not to say other religions do not have it, or have love at the center of them, but it is to suggest that perhaps with Christ that has become a this evolution, this unifying force has become self-aware. And so he sort of says that so this becomes a sort of omega point, greater and greater unification, synthesis, and people have forgotten this. People, quoting Teilhard, people no longer know how to occupy their physical powers, but what is more serious, they do not know toward what universal and final end they should direct the driving force of their souls. It has already been said, though without sufficiently deep appreciation of the words, the present crisis is a spiritual crisis, one that his project really attends to. So these were some questions I thought were important then to sort of, based on Teilhard's vision, what kind of questions can we consider with regards to artificial intelligence? How can artificial intelligence perhaps ensure that these energy flows are moving equitably through the different spheres, biosphere, noosphere, Christosphere as a whole, not just through human society, but at the expense of the biosphere? If a cosmotheanthropic principle incarnated in a person, what might it look like in an algorithm or a program? What information is relevant for the next stage of complexity consciousness? And then can maybe artificial intelligence be used in a way that moves beyond egocentric concerns to kind of ego transcendence? And so to put it sort of very succinctly maybe, can artificial intelligence ensure these energy flows are equitably distributed throughout the biosphere? I think that institutionalizing this idea of an amorized routine and this cosmotheanthropic principle in a very sort of common way, thank you, would be potentially a closest thing to a silver bullet that I can think of, a sort of way of shifting this paradigm so that you don't have the type of suffering that is correlated with inefficient energy flows, deprivation, etc. And I think another question worth asking is whether artificial intelligence is absolutely necessary to this task. I think that's a question worth thinking about, considering this possibility is always present to us, where we can sort of share freely, but maybe we need artificial intelligence to synchronize and concretize that mode of conscious complexity at first. So two different quotes, one from Gospel of Matthew, speaking to maybe that energy flow, but I'm just going to share this one from Teilhard. The day will come when, after harnessing space, the winds, the tides, gravitation, we shall harness for God the energies of love. And on that day, for the second time in the history of the world, humankind will have discovered fire. So thank you. That was my presentation. And I'll leave Teilhard's perspective up for you. Thank you.
Yes.
I have actually been working on a project together with
I'm sorry, can you just put that?
Hello. I have been working on a project together with some collaborators that we call offer networks. The idea is that different people express their offers, what they are willing to give, their needs, what they need, and that an artificial intelligence system tries to equilibrate all these things over the whole world, but not only with people, also with the ecosphere. That means you would put in the needs of the ecosystem and you would put the offers of the ecosystem, and then you have some mathematical models that can try to find a general equilibrium in which there is a circulation, to use my term, of all these different things so that you use them in the most efficient possible way. So it is one way to approach this problem. A second comment is when you speak about love, I personally would use a more, let's say, scientific term, which is the search for coherence or synergy. You're looking for somebody or something with whom you resonate, with whom you have a synergetic relationship, meaning that you enhance each other, that you mutually enhance each other. In that sense, you can call it love, but if you speak about physical entities, you can also have this synergy between them, which you wouldn't call love. And then finally, your use of the terms Christ does not appeal to me personally as a scientist. I understand that you use it as a metaphor, but I think if you want to convince other people who may not be Christians or Catholics, you should use other terms to express the same ideas.
Yeah. Just to respond very quickly, I very much appreciate taking into account the biosphere. I think there tends to be a degree of anthropocentrism that I'm happy you are addressing. In terms of love, yes, this is Teilhard's language, so I'm sort of conveying that. And his sense of divine love of God and love for God, I think, is central in his system. So I appreciate the coherence, and I think that what his point is as this sort of, gravitational attraction that we might consider in a more cosmological, scientific sense, becomes harmonized or becomes put in the human form, that is a sort of more common way we consider it, and then we can sort of extrapolate other things. And again, with the Christ, I understand we have different symbol systems. I have my own sort of checkered past with Christianity. What I'm looking at more is Christ as a symbol that can convey information in order to sort of redistribute the sort of a cosmological primacy or energy flows, whereas before, in a civilization like the Roman Empire, you have a very hierarchical, violent society based on empire, based on imperialism. Injecting a symbol like Christ worked to potentially rebirth that principle in the symbolic system that was right at that time. So I certainly agree that we're at a different time where that symbol may not work as well. That said, there are a lot of evangelical Christians who I think need to be convinced, and this might be a vehicle to convince those people who would otherwise not be. So, thank you. Last one?
Thank you, Matt. Real quick question here. Within this framework of this Christocentric framework, have you noticed in Teilhard or anywhere else the connection between transubstantiation and this notion of a cosmic consciousness? Is there any correlation to that at all?
In Teilhard's work, is there a correlation between the Christos? Yeah, I think
Convergence from energy into matter, God into body, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm not sure. I should look up more. My sense is that the transubstantiation occurs when we become aware of matter as the material component of spirit or love or the psychic dimension. And so, whereas we might sort of have a very materialistic perspective of the cosmos, once we sort of switch that awareness, that's when maybe the transubstantiation happens. But again, I should read more into it. But thank you, Elle, for the opportunity again.
Thank you.